بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. The author goes on to talk about the blessed act of fasting, and so he mentions Babu Siyam, and Allah Azza wa Jal mentions that Kutiba alaykum as-siyamu kama kutiba ala alladhina min qablikum la'allakum tattaqun, that Allah has prescribed or has ordained or has obligated for you the month of Ramadan, yani fasting, referring to the month of Ramadan. Kutiba alaykum as-siyamu kama kutiba ala alladhina min qablikum, the way just as He has prescribed it for the nations before us. But the thing here, the next thing that Allah Azza wa Jal mentions is the reason for the fasting. لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ, yani in hope that you might obtain taqwa. Or we can translate it, yani for the sake of taqwa. So the aim and objective behind fasting is to obtain taqwa. And one of the important things to know is that when we have a reason for something, or when Allah gives us a reason for something, the reason itself is more important than the action itself, because the action is only performed for the sake of the reason behind it. And so the aim and objective behind fasting is to obtain taqwa, and we can generally translate taqwa as to be God-fearing. And Ibn Ashur, rahimahullah, in his famous Al-Murshid Al-Mu'in, mentions حاصل التقوى اجتناب وامتثال في ظاهر وباطن بذا تنال, that to understand taqwa in a nutshell, what is taqwa? It means حاصل التقوى اجتناب وامتثال, to stay, or ijtinabun means to stay away from those things that Allah has made, that Allah has not allowed you to do, or has made haram, or those things that are not permissible. Wamtithalun means to do those things that Allah has ordered you to do, and to follow the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Imtithalun, walakin al-imtithal wal ijtinab occurs in two places: fi zahirin, outwardly, wa batinin, and inwardly, bidha tunal, and by doing this one will obtain taqwa. So the nutshell of taqwa is to be obedient to Allah by doing those things that He has ordered you to do, and to stay away from those things that He has not permitted for you to do. But that obedience should be outward, meaning that a person does the act or abstains from the act, and it should be inward. And inward as well means that the person is not only conforming to that act outwardly, but he is conforming to that act inwardly. So when he does the act outwardly, and he does the act inwardly, meaning that he likes what he's doing, or that he submits himself to doing it, and inside of his heart he is not contrary to what he's doing. For example, Allah has ordained us to fast, we perform the act, and we are not at odds inside of our hearts about the performing of it. Oh, it's too difficult, or I don't want to do it. So the higher level of taqwa from an inward perspective is that when a person performs the act not only because it's obligatory, but because he loves being in obedience to Allah. And that's what the Prophet ﷺ mentions, that is the sweetness of Iman. When a person's outward obedience and his outward obedience, whether it's abstaining from something or performing something, is done out of love, or it is done out of want for worshiping their Lord. That is the understanding of taqwa. So this month of Ramadan and fasting is about obtaining taqwa. That is the aim and objective. And for this reason, we sustain from food and we sustain from other things, or we abstain from food and other things, because when we abstain from food, one's level of taqwa is higher because of the fact that his mind is not on his desires. It's not as on his carnal desires, because he's not thinking about sexual intercourse. He's not thinking about food, but he's directly and solely leaving all of these actions for the sake of pleasing Allah. So this is why the issue of fasting, why it is such an important thing, because it helps one to obtain taqwa. So moving on to the topic, the author mentions وَالصَّوْمُ رَمَضَانَ فَرِيدَةٌ يَثْبُتُ بِكَمَالِ الشَّعْبَانَ أو برؤية عدلين للهلال أو جماعة مستفيدة. Yani we're going to keep it very basic here. He mentions وَالصَّوْمُ رَمَضَانَ فَرِيدَةٌ, it is obligatory. Then he's going to mention how do we establish Ramadan. يَثْبُتُ بِكَمَالِ الشَّعْبَانَ, that it is established by the completion of Sha'aban. And Sha'aban can either be 29 days or 30 days, as we will clarify later. Or أو برؤية عدلين للهلال أو برؤية عدلين للهلال, or the seeing of two pious people the hilal, meaning that two pious people have spotted the hilal. What does that mean? It means that two pious people have come to you saying that they spotted the hilal, which is the moon sighting. Doesn't mean that two pious people came up to you and said, I heard from so and so and so and so and so and so and so. It means yani biru'yati adlaini lil hilal, that two pious people came to you and said that they saw the hilal. And what do we mean by pious people? People who avoid major sins and are not consistent in performing minor sins, meaning they don't always perform minor sins. So it means that they avoid major sins all the time and they avoid the minor sins most of the time, and that they don't do anything that's considered contrary to bad manners. So that's the general idea of adlaini lil hilal. And he mentions aw jama'atin mustafidatin. Aw jama'atin mustafidatin means that yani a large amount of people mention that they spotted the hilal. So for example, you're going to the mosque, everybody's saying, I saw the hilal, I saw the hilal. Then Ramadan would be established. Now, to make it clear here, what does he mean by biru'yati adlayni lil hilali aw jama'atin mustafidatin? We mentioned before that Ramadan is established bi kamal Sha'aban, and sometimes Sha'aban is going to be 29 days, or sometimes it's going to be 30 days. Now, the issue comes into play on the 29th night, which is important. The 29th night. Because the 29th, we have to understand also that the new day comes in after Maghrib. So let's take this step by step. The 28th of Sha'aban comes in after Maghrib. So after Maghrib comes in on the after Maghrib comes in, we'll have the 28th day. And then the daytime will come on the 28th, and that will be called the 28th day. So we have the 28th night and the 28th day. So the night comes before the day according to the Islamic calendar. So now on the 28th day of Sha'aban, we are waiting for the Maghrib to come, which is the 29th night. Because the 29th night is the first night that we're going to look for the hilal. If we see the hilal, then we know that the 29th day will be the starting of Ramadan. If we don't see the hilal, then we automatically know that the 30th day is going to be the first of Sha'aban, and so that will be the first of the month of Ramadan. So the controversy happens on the 29th night. Because on the 29th night, maybe some people saw it, maybe some people didn't. So if on the 29th night, two pious people came to you, for example, two imams of your city, are the students of knowledge, two of them, one of them came to you, or one of them called your phone and said, I saw it. If one person called you, then that's not enough to establish that Ramadan happened. But now let's say you get a second phone call. If you get a second phone call now, then that means that two pious people told you that they saw the hilal. Now it's obligatory for you to fast. Or let's say everybody in the masjids around your local neighborhood are all saying that they saw the hilal, or a group of people from one mosque went out to the outskirts of the city to do the moon sighting, and they all said they saw the moon sighting. Then in this case, Ramadan would be established, and that's what he means by biru'yati adlaini, by the seeing of two pious people, or jama'atun mustafidatin lil hilali, for the hilal, yani the moon sighting. Now, otherwise, as we'll talk about later, there's something called Yom al-Shak, and we'll talk about that the other day. Let's say you hear no news on the 29th night. For example, nobody called you, you couldn't get any information, whether or not you couldn't establish by one of the criteria that we mentioned, whether or not the moon sighting was there. So now you're going to wake up on the 29th day and you're not sure if it's Ramadan or not. That's what we're going to talk about later on, and it's called Yom al-Shak. That's the day in which you did not receive no news of the 29th night, and so now you're walking around in the day, or the next day comes and you're not sure whether Ramadan has come out, has come in or not, and we'll talk about that later. So that's what he means when he talks about the things that establish the Ramadan. So he says, وَكَذَلِكَ فِي الْفِطْرِ وَكَذَلِكَ فِي الْفِطْرِ, and the same thing goes for the end of Ramadan, al-Fitr, right, which is the day of Eid. We're going to look at the end of the month to see whether or not the hilal has been spotted for Ramadan, yes or no. If we do not spot it, then it will be the following day, as the same way that we established the beginning of Ramadan. Then he goes on to say, وَيُبَيِّتُ الصِّيَامَ فِي أَوِّلِهِ وَلَيْسَ عَلَيْهِ الْبَيَاتُ فِي بَقِيَّتِهِ وَيُتِمُّ الصِّيَامَ إِلَى اللَّيْلِ. Understand that according to the Maliki school, making the niyyah at the beginning of Ramadan is sufficient for all of Ramadan, because the Ramadan is all considered like one act of worship. So making your niyyah at the beginning of Ramadan before Fajr is sufficient for all of Ramadan, which means that you don't have to make niyyah for the rest of the days. But make a very important side note here. That is under the condition that nothing comes between your obligation to fast. For example, if a person travels, they're not obligated to fast. And so maybe they might go 1 or 2 days without fasting. When they fast again, then they have to make another niyyah. Because the condition for what I just mentioned, as long as something does not come in between the Ramadan, which necessitates that fasting is not obligatory. Another example is menses. So let's say, for example, a woman is fasting at the beginning of Ramadan. She makes her niyyah. She doesn't get menses until the first 10 days. For the first 10 days, the first niyyah is okay. But after her menses is done, she must have another niyyah to complete her Ramadan. So the one niyyah is sufficient as long as the obligation to fast is not nullified for some of the valid reasons during the month. So this is the meaning here when he says, وَيُبَيِّتُ الصِّيَامَ فِي أَوِّلِهِ. يُبَيِّتُ الصِّيَامَ generally means to have the niyyah during the night. It cannot be from the previous day. For example, if Ramadan is going to be on the 29th day, you cannot make the niyyah on the 28th day. It has to be on the 29th night. That's what he means, وَيُبَيِّتُ الصِّيَامِ, meaning to make your niyyah at night, meaning after the Maghrib. في أوله, at the beginning of Ramadan. وَلَيْسَ عَلَيْهِ الْبَيَاتُ فِي بَقِيَّتِهِ, and it is not obligatory on him الْبَيَاتُ فِي بَقِيَّتِهِ, meaning to make a niyyah during the night for every day of fasting. Then he says, وَيُتِمُّ الصِّيَامَ إِلَى اللَّيْلِ, and he should complete his fasting until the night, meaning until Maghrib. Then he goes on to say, وَمِنَ السُنَّةِ تَعْجِيلُ الْفِطْرِ وَتَأْخِيرُ السُّحُورِ وَحَيْثُ ثَبَتَ الشَّهْرُ قَبْلَ الْفَجْرِ وَجَبَ الصَّوْمُ. Here he says, وَمِنَ السُنَّةِ تَعْجِيلُ الْفِطْرِ. Yeah, and he's going to mention some things that are considered sunnah. And so he says, from the things that are sunnah is ta'ajil al-fitri. Ta'ajil al-fitri meaning to break your fast as soon as the Maghrib comes in. But it is important to add here, as soon as you are sure that Maghrib has come in. Not when you have doubt. So it is as soon as you are sure that the Maghrib is in, you should break your fast. From here, we should also not make the mistake or the one of the common practices that you see happening here in some Western countries, where the people eat a whole entire meal before they pray their Maghrib. Breaking your fast means to eat a few dates, which is sunnah, to break your fast with dates or water. So you break your fast, you pray your Maghrib, and then you go and feast. Unfortunately, many people are feasting until basically the time for Maghrib is gone out, and then they're going to pray. So what a person does is breaks their fast with a drink of water, with dates preferably, or something small, or water if there's nothing else. They pray their Maghrib, and then they go and enjoy their feast. So that's what he meant. وَمِنَ السُّنَّةِ تَعْجِيلُ الْفِطْرِ وَتَأْخِيرُ السُّحُورِ. تَأْخِيرُ السُّحُورِ means to delay the eating till the end of the night. For example, Fajr comes in at 4 o'clock. Don't eat your suhoor at 2 o'clock, because the purpose of suhoor is to eat enough food to try to carry you out through the day. So if, let's say, Fajr comes in at 4:07, we should stop eating around 3, maybe about 10 to 15 minutes before, just to be sure that we don't find ourselves eating during Fajr. So what he actually means by وَتَأْخِيرُ السُّحُورِ, meaning to delay the eating until closer to Fajr and not at the beginning of the night, because the purpose of eating the suhoor as a sunnah is to help a person to maintain throughout the day. Then he says, وَحَيْثُ ثَبَتَ الشَّهْرُ قَبْلَ الْفَجْرِ وَجَبَ الصَّوْمُ. And so he says here, and if the Shahr of Ramadan is established before Fajr, wajib as-sawmu. What does he mean by before Fajr? We talked about this earlier, about if, for example, on the night of on the 29th night, if the moon was sighted, then the following day, which would be the 29th day, it is obligatory to fast. But then he says, وَإِن لَمْ يَثْبُتْ إِلَّا بَعْدَ الْفَجْرِ وَجَبَ الْإِمْسَاكُ وَلَا بُدَّ مِنْ قَضَاءِ ذَلِكَ الْيَوْمِ. Okay, let's say now on the 29th night, people informed you that the hilal was seen and fasting is established. So tomorrow will be the first of Ramadan. But let's just say you didn't know until after Fajr. So for example, you went to sleep early on the 29th night and people were calling your cell phone, but you didn't answer. So you woke up on the 29th night and you didn't think it was Ramadan, so you started eating. Right? And then somebody called you and said, today's Ramadan. From the minute you hear, or from the minute that Ramadan is established, right? Like you checked your voice messages, and two pious people, or the halal committee of many people, left messages on your phone, or you opened up your email and so on and so forth, and you were, after the time that you listened to these messages, you were eating your breakfast. Wajab al-imsaku. At that time, it is obligatory for you to stop eating even the food in your mouth. If you were to swallow the food of in your mouth at the time that you were reading, or you were being informed that it was Ramadan and you swallowed, then you're going to have to pay the penalty of kafara, which we're talking about. In this case here, it's wajib al-imsak, which means that at that time that you get the news, you must stop eating. And then he says, وَلَا بُدَّ مِنْ قَضَاءِ ذَلِكَ الْيَوْمِ, and it is obligatory to make that day up after Ramadan. So you wouldn't have to pay the penalty of kafara, which we will talk about later. But since that day was Ramadan and you ate, then all you have to do is make up that fast after the Ramadan is done. It cannot be made up during Ramadan. Obviously, it has to be made up outside of Ramadan. Then he's going to talk about وَالنِّيَّةُ قَبْلَ الثُّبُوتِ الشَّهْرِ بَاطِلَةٌ حَتَّى لَوْ نَوَى قَبْلَ الرُّؤْيَةِ ثُمَّ أَصْبَحَ لم يأكل ولم يشرب ثم تبين له أن ذلك اليوم من رمضان لم يجزيه ويمسك عن الأكل والشرب فيه لحرمة الشهر ويقضيه. Here he's talking about an important mas'ala, which is called niyyatu qabla thubut ash-shahri, meaning intending to fast before Ramadan has been established. For example, now it's the 29th night and nobody's seen the hilal. You haven't received any news that the hilal has been seen, and nor have you seen the hilal for yourself. So you think to yourself, well, since tomorrow might be Ramadan, I'm going to intend to fast Ramadan now. That wouldn't be accepted, because in order to have a sound niyyah, it has to be jazm, meaning it has to be certain. Right now you're making a niyyah with doubt. And according to the Malikiyah, having a niyyah with doubt nullifies the niyyah, because you cannot intend something in which you have doubt in. So that's what he says, وَنِيَّةُ قَبْلَ ثُبُوتِ الشَّهْرِ بَاطِلَةٌ. Making the intention before the establishment of the month, meaning the month of Ramadan, is batilatun, is invalid. Right? And then he's going to give you an example how this can go. Hatta law nawa qabla ru'yati. So if a person were to intend before seeing the hilal, thumma asbaha, and then he woke up on the following day, which means the 29th day, lam ya'kul wa lam yashrab, and he didn't eat. So, and the reason why he didn't eat is because he said it might be Ramadan, so I'm not going to eat. ثُمَّ تَبَيَّنَ لَهُ أَنَّ ذَلِكَ الْيَوْمِ مِنْ رَمَضَانَ. Then it became clear to him, or he was informed, that that day was Ramadan. لَمْ يُجْزِيهِ. That day that he intended to fast would not be sufficient, meaning it wouldn't count. وَيُمْسِكُ عَنِ الْأَكْلِ وَالشُّرْبِ فِيهِ. But he is obligated to stop eating and drinking in that day and the rest of that day for a reason. لِحُرْمَةِ الشَّهْرِ. We have something called hurmat al-shahri. Hurmat al-shahri means that the time of the month of Ramadan is a time frame in which it is not permissible for a person to eat from Fajr, from the time of Fajr, until the sun goes down. That's why even if a person were to break his fast by an accident, he's still obligated to continue his fast. For example, let's say a person ate a tomato by accident, and then he said, okay, my fast is broken, I have to make it up. So since I have to make it up, I might as well just eat for the rest of the day. This is not permissible, because the month of Ramadan is a time period in which eating from Fajr to Maghrib is not permissible. So that's what it means by the hurmat al-shahri. Right? Now, to clarify the example, if you were fasting a nafilah prayer outside of Ramadan and you broke your fast, then it's pointless to continue your fast, and a person could eat from there, because there is no hurmat al-zaman. It is not a month in which it is not permissible for you to eat from Fajr to sunset. And then he says after that, وَيَقْدِيهِ, and then he must make it up. Then he's going to add an important point. وَلَا يُصَامُ يَوْمَ الشَّكِّ لِيُحْتَاطَ بِهِ مِنْ رَمَضَانٍ. And this line that he's going to mention here is only confirming to you the line that we just mentioned. He said, وَلَا يُصَامُ يَوْمَ الشَّكِّ. A person does not fast for the sake of Ramadan, يَوْمَ الشَّكِّ. And Yom Shek means the day of doubt, and the day of doubt is what I just mentioned to you before, what we just talked about previous, where a person is going to wake up on the 29th day because he didn't see the moon on the 29th night before, and so he's going to fast it because he wants to, so he assumes to fast it because if it is Ramadan, then it means he will have caught it. But we just mentioned that that's not permissible. So here he's just clarifying that it is la yusamu, that the day of Yom Shek is not to be fasted yuhtata bihi, for the sake of taking a precaution min Ramadan. In other words, in short, you do not fast that day of the Shek as if it's Ramadan. So you wake up and you say, yeah, I'm going to fast this morning just in case it's Ramadan, because that won't count, and it's considered makruh to do so if you have the intention to do it for this for the sake of taking caution for Ramadan. But it is permissible to fast it as a voluntary fast, right? There's nothing wrong with fasting just for the sake of fasting, or fasting for the sake of getting a reward. And that's why he says, وَيُجُوزُ صِيَامُهُ. It is permissible to fast during it لِلتَّطَوُّعِ, for the sake of doing something that's recommended. وَالنَّذْرِ إِذَا صَادَفَ. وَالنَّذْرِ إِذَا صَادَفَ, meaning a person was to make a nadri here means when a person swears to do something. So for example, the person says, on August 1st next year, I swear by Allah that I'm going to fast. And then it happens to be that August 1st is the Yom Shek. Then it's also permissible for him to fast. The reality is, in a nutshell, what it means is that it's permissible for a person to fast any non-obligatory fast, but it is not permissible for a person to fast the Yom Shek in precaution that it might be for the sake of Ramadan. That's disliked, and it wouldn't even be acceptable from him, even if it was Ramadan. Then he says, وَيُسْتَحَبُّ الْإِمْسَاكُ فِي أَوِّلِهِ لِيَتَحَقَّقَ النَّاسُ الرُّؤْيَةَ فَإِنْ ارْتَفَعَ النَّهَارُ وَلَمْ تَظْهَرْ رُؤْيَةٌ أَفْطَرَ النَّاسُ. Here he says, وَيُسْتَحَبُّ الْإِمْسَاكُ فِي أَوِّلِهِ لِيَتَحَقَّقَ النَّاسُ. Even the Yom Shek, although here he's talking about the Yom Shek again, even if we don't know it's going to be Ramadan, and it wouldn't be accepted from us to fast the day of Yom Shek because we don't have certainty that's from Ramadan, it is still mustahab not to eat at the beginning of the day hatta لِيُحَقِّقَ النَّاسُ الرُّؤْيَةَ, until just enough time to see if the ru'ya from last night was established. Because as I mentioned here, we have another important factor. Although the moon although that day will not be counted as Ramadan, there's still hurmat al-zaman, meaning there's still the prohibition of eating during that sacred month. And so we're just going to take the precautions not to take that for granted. So وَيُسْتَحَبُّ الْإِمْسَاكُ, it is recommended to refrain from food fi awwalihi, right, at the beginning of it, meaning the beginning of the day of Yom Shek. لِيَتَحَقَّقَ النَّاسُ, in order to establish, so that until the people establish a ru'ya, meaning the sighting of the moon, whether somebody saw it or not. So for example, we wake up the following day, everybody's skeptical, was the moon sighted or wasn't it sighted? So let's say by noontime, it's well established now that the moon wasn't sighted. Okay, eat, right? So that's why it says فَإِنِ ارْتَفَعَ النَّهَارُ, right? If the issue was established in the day, during the day, وَلَمْ تَظْهَرْ رُؤْيَةٌ, and it was clear that the ru'yatun wasn't established, أَفْطَرَ النَّاسُ, then the people should eat. Now, according to the Malikiyah, they say wujuban. It's obligatory for the people to eat at that because your fasting would be meaningless at this point. So that's what it says, وَلَمْ تَظْهَرْ رُؤْيَةٌ أَفْتَرَ النَّاسُ. Then the people should break their fast. Then he says, وَلَا يُفْتِرُ مَنْ ذَرَعَهُ قَيْءٌ إِلَّا أَنْ يُعَالِجَ خُرُوجَهُ فعليه القضاء ولا يفطر من احتلم ولا من احتجم وتكره الحجامة للمريض خيفة التغرير. Now he's just going to jump into a couple of things that wouldn't necessitate that a person has broken his fast. He says, وَلَا يُفْتِرُ مَنْ ذَرَعَهُ قَيْءٌ. Breaking a person who was to vomit a person who was to vomit uncontrollably. So, for example, vomit came out of a person's mouth. That doesn't nullify his prayer. That doesn't nullify his fast. In other words, he wouldn't be requested to make up that fast if food were to come out of his throat. إِلَّا أَن يُعَالِجَ خُرُوجَهُ. Unless that person was the cause for the vomit to come out. So vomiting unintentionally does not break a person's fast, but if a person, for example, was to stick his finger and put it down his throat to throw something up, then that would nullify his fast, right? فَعَلَيْهِ الْقَضَاءُ. And it would be obligatory for him to make it up after Ramadan, but there's no kafara here, which we will explain later. Here we're just talking about qada. Then he says, وَلَا يُفْتِرُ مَنِ احْتَلَمَ. Also, a person who has a wet dream, his fast is not broken because he didn't do it intentionally. For example, a person who was sleeping during the midday and woke up and had a wet dream, then that doesn't nullify his fast. وَلَا مَنِ احْتَجَمَ. A person who was to do hijama, blood cupping, doesn't nullify his fast, but it is disliked for a person who is sick to do hijama if it fears that it's going to cause him some type of dizziness. So what does it mean by a person who's sick? Meaning if you're healthy, right, and your customs and the norm is that when you do hijama, it doesn't affect you when you do blood cupping, then there's no dislike. It's dislike for a person who's sick, and that's what it says, وَتُكْرَهُ الْحِجَامَةُ لِلْمُرِيدِ خِيفَةَ التَّغْيِيرِ أو تَغْرِيرِ. Yani out of fear that it might cause a person to some danger or some type of dizziness, or possibly causing a person to pass out. Doesn't nullify his fast. وَلَا مَنِ احْتَجَمَ. A person who was to do hijama, blood cupping, doesn't nullify his fast, but it is disliked for a person who is sick to do hijama if it fears that it's going to cause him some type of dizziness. So what does it mean by a person who's sick? Meaning if you're healthy, right, and your customs and the norm is that when you do hijama, it doesn't affect you when you do blood cupping, then there's no dislike. It's dislike for a person who's sick, and that's what it says, وَتُكْرَهُ الْحِجَامَةُ لِلْمُرِيدِ خِيفَةَ التَّغْيِيرِ أو تَغْرِيرِ. Yani out of fear that it might cause a person to some danger or some type of dizziness, or possibly causing a person to pass out.